Welcome to a spooky history mystery. I'm Mimi, and with Halloween soon approaching, I thought this might be a good time for a spooky story. Before we start, I'd like to give a fair warning. This story gets a little dark and may not be suitable for all audiences. I would also like to thank Connor Lee at History Atlanta, who did so much research on this topic already and has more details on the case for anyone interested in learning more. Still here? Then gather round, and I'll tell you a story about corruption and misdoings that affected one family from Thomasville a long time ago. The land on which the Thomasville History Center sits has passed through several owners over the past 200 years of Thomasville history, from the original Native American farmers and hunters to the American settlers and beyond. One of these owners was a man by the name of Baker Augustus Bass, or Baker A. Bass, if you want him to sound like a character from the Andy Griffith Show. Bass was born in Halifax, North Carolina, during the winter of 1853. The Bass family were extremely wealthy, thanks to the use of enslaved labor on their plantation. But being the youngest of 15 children, Baker couldn't rest on his laurels and wait for his inheritance, especially after the Civil War. And it's a good thing he didn't, because his parents left nothing to their children in their wills. After his father's death in 1873, Bass left North Carolina and ventured down to Thomasville. In the following years, Bass worked as a clerk in a general store downtown and married Eleanor or Ella McKinnon. By 1880, he and his father-in-law John Nathaniel McKinnon opened their own general store, Bass and McKinnon, located on Broad Street. With business booming, Bass had the money to invest in real estate. He set his sights on some farmland near what was then the edge of town. Over a few years, Bass transformed the area that now makes up the northern end of Dawson Street into a thriving farmland he called Magnolia Farms. Very Joanna Gaines of him. This farmland was covered in various specialty crops from fruits to vegetables to nuts, as well as supporting livestock with enough room for several outbuildings, tenant houses, a water tower, and his own home, which once stood on the 700 block of North Dawson Street. He and his wife raised their 4 children on the property and held several parties for family, friends, and their community. But the good times included some struggles along the way. Bass enjoyed a good party, and maybe a little too much. For example, in 1888, he lost a bag full of money in bills, along with his dirty laundry, while riding in a wagon from a Mardi Gras celebration. The next year, he hosted a barbecue fundraiser for the Stock Breeders Association, but some of his donors forgot to pay him back for their part. Only a few months later, his father-in-law retired from their business, and Bass had to strike out alone, this time in Atlanta. Bass seemed to have too many irons in the fire. Speaking of fire, in March of 1891, the Bass family suffered a loss when their Dawson Street property caught fire. The flames started in the barn and quickly spread to the water tower. Thanks to the local fire department, the main house was saved, though the barn was destroyed. The local paper reported that the source of the fire was a mystery, but the barn was full of hay and other typical flammable farm supplies. Insurance paid Bass $1,000 for his loss. It seemed Bass was having terrible luck with fire at this time. Just a little over a year later, his home near Atlanta burned to the ground. Bass was certain that it was the work of an arsonist. This time, the insurance covered $2,000 in damages. Ever discreet, none of the Thomasville newspapers questioned the source of Bass's bad luck. And it didn't end there. At some point, Bass misplaced the deed to his mother-in-law's property in Thomasville. His plans to get rich quick with a fruit crop fell through, and he was forced to rent out his Thomasville property, and his family had to move to downtown Atlanta. The early 1890s were turning into a tough time for the Bass family. But things hit a really low point in the year of 1895. As with most illegal doings, the written records from some of Bass's work are impossible to come by, but his family was at least slightly aware of his involvement with some shady characters. On Monday, September 2nd, Bass was expected to report to a grand jury to discuss his involvement with, or knowledge of, a gang of thieves that stole goods for resale in Atlanta stores. Maybe he merely knew of the thieves. Maybe he was directly involved. The court never got a firm answer on that matter, and they never would, as Bass never made it to his court date. On the morning of Friday, August 30th, 1895, Baker A. Bass went about his usual routine. Wake up early, walk to work. Ella recalled that he seemed his usual chipper self that morning, with nothing unusual to call her attention. He took his usual path, down Ellis Street, Ivy Street, just reaching the area behind the De Gives Theater, that's the future home of the Lowe's Grand and the premiere of Gone with the Wind. At that moment, he passed by a vacant lot with overgrowth spilling over the edges. It was there that someone jumped out and attacked Bass from behind, pulling at his jacket and shirt, knocking him down, and then shooting him behind the ear. Bass lay dying for nearly 15 minutes before he was discovered by 2 policemen and a hotel worker who spotted him. A crowd soon gathered, including one of his sons who heard about the incident while at work, and an ambulance was called. Bass was taken to Grady Hospital, where doctors examined his wound and attempted to make him comfortable. With little to do for such a grave injury, Bass was sent home, where he died around noon. Almost immediately, an inquest into his death was called, starting a case that would pit the Atlanta Police Department against the Bass family and public opinion. There was no one around to witness the attack. When Bass was found, his hat had been knocked off, his shirt collar and jacket were slightly ripped and muddled, and he was found with a pistol in his hand containing 3 unfired bullets. The Atlanta detectives assigned to the case called it a suicide, but they were quickly disproved by the doctors and other witnesses who came forward. The wound didn't match the telltale signs of self-infliction. His clothes showed signs of a scuffle. Nothing in his home life suggested such action might take place. Still, the detectives stuck with their theory. As you can imagine, Ella Bass was less than thrilled with these detectives. The doctor and coroner who examined Bass swore his death was caused by someone else, and the detective's story implicated Bass as a leader in a seedy underworld of crime. She posted a reward of $300 to anyone with proof that her husband had been murdered. Meanwhile, both sides of the case lawyered up, with the Bass family attorney finding all sorts of witnesses to various related incidents, and the attorneys for the detectives rushing to clean up the damage done to their clients by rightfully suspicious newspapers. Over the next year, several versions of the story would come up in court. In one version, various members of the Atlanta crime scene had it out for Bass, who knew his number would soon be up. Either his former henchmen were the killers, or a desperate Bass beat them to the draw. In another version, Atlanta detectives Green Conn and Will Mahaffey suspected Bass of having more influence in the crime community than he truly did. Wanting their own shiny gold stars for cleaning up the city, the 2 detectives themselves had gone corrupt, harassing Bass and threatening to harm him in the days leading up to his murder. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, only one person was ever brought to trial for the murder of Baker A. Bass, and twice at that. A man by the name of Christopher Columbus Johnson, or C.C., was implicated in the early days of the investigation. Johnson had recently been imprisoned for a related incident. He stole a barrel of lard from another store, allegedly intending to sell it to Bass. In fact, the broken-up barrel had been found behind Bass's store. This was the case that brought Bass to the attention of detectives Conn and Mahaffey. Only Johnson could be convicted for the crime, and spent 4 months in jail as he could not pay the $50 fine. It was alleged by many, including his girlfriend, that he was hoping Bass would pay his fine so he could be released. Bass reportedly refused. Johnson may have held on to his grudge as he was released from jail on August 29th, the day before Bass's murder. All these accusations led to several trials, all of which either ended in mistrial or with a hung jury. There were too many people with motive to come to a single conclusion on the nature of the murder. In conclusion, the public, spurred on by the newspapers, further distrusted the Atlanta police, whose members slowly came out of the woodwork with their own tales of corruption on the squad. As for the Bass family, they were left without a father figure or an answer as to why he was taken from them. As always, Bass had prepared for the worst and had several life insurance policies that helped the family stay afloat. A few months after his burial, his family had the Woodmen of the World, which Bass was a member of, erect a tombstone in his honor, which can still be seen today at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Thomasville. If this video interested you, be sure to check out our website and social media, where you can find more stories and pictures like these. During the months of September, October, and November, we will be hosting our special edition Tiptoe Through the Tombstone tours, Murder and Mayhem, where stories, including the one you just heard, will be told as we wander through local cemeteries. Be sure to leave us a like on this video. And as always, thanks for watching!